Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. Just over 20 years ago, a group of Peoria, Illinois 8th grade English and history students, under the guidance of their teacher, Tim Pletkovich, embarked on an ambitious project requiring the students to write to the sons and daughters of Civil War Union veterans to collect information about the lives of their fathers. It was soon realized that many of the children of the Union soldiers were themselves veterans of World War II. What began as an interesting and educational school assignment quickly became an engaging and fascinating journey for the students, their teacher, and the Civil War children with whom they were corresponding, ultimately resulting in a book titled Civil War Fathers, Sons of the Civil War in World War II. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we'll be speaking with author, teacher, and historian Tim Pletkovich. Tim, who edited the various correspondence from this project, also added his own extensive research about the lives of the soldiers profiled in the book. He will tell us how this project came to be and will share from some of the history and personal stories gleaned from the work accomplished by his dedicated students. I'd now like to welcome Tim Pletkovich to our show. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you for having me, James. It's wonderful to be here today with you.
So glad to have you on the show. So there's this amazing book that I just read called Civil War Fathers, Sons of the Civil War in World War II. And this is a book that you edited, and I think it's from 2007. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Hard to believe that it's 17 years old and still doing well.
Yeah, what the story is that you and I spoke because I had seen a post somewhere about this amazing book that you had that talked about these people who were actual sons of Civil War veterans who themselves were World War II veterans. And it was just so cool. And when I got the book, you sent me a copy of the book and I read it. It was like nothing I've ever read before. It was right up my alley for that sort of almost like a generational transfer of history, both in the subject matter and also those who collected the data for this book. It was a whole generational passing of history, and it was just
Yes.
fantastic. But before we talk about the book, I want to ask you about yourself. Are you okay with talking about yourself?
Oh, I'm fine with that, James. I think so, at least.
Well, so how did you get interested in history and also writing? What's your background, Tim?
Yeah. James, I was always very, very interested in writing from the time I was a kid. I was always writing stories. And so I guess my parents wouldn't be too surprised if they were with us today to see the fruits of all of that, because they did a lot to engender that interest in me as well. And I was always interested in history from an early age. And, my parents inculcated a lot of family history as well as local, regional, national history in me. Living in Illinois, I have distinct memories of going to visit New Salem, Illinois, Lincoln's village, at a very early age. I was in first grade, and I remember being hooked at that time. So it's just kind of burgeoned all from there. But yeah, also very, very interested in family history. I have a very diverse background, maybe just very much the epitome of the American experience. My paternal grandparents were natives of Croatia, current day Croatia. They were Serbian. And on my mother's side, most of her ancestry in the American colonies dates back to the 1630s, mostly, a little bit prior to that, because I have multiple ancestors who came across on the Mayflower. But most of her ancestors came to the United States or to the American colonies within a 5-year period of 1635. Very, very typical of the great Puritan migration from the southeast section of England to what is today considered New England. James, also just a little bit of background. As I mentioned, I was always interested in writing. I was writing for a local newspaper beginning at the age of 13 and continued on with that as well as playing sports. And when it came time for me to go to college, I went to Eastern Illinois University. I majored in physical education, having a strong sports background. And my minor was in journalism. So I've utilized both of those areas of concentration to a great deal throughout my life. I started out after graduating from college going to work for the Cubs. I signed a contract to scout for the Cubs when I was 21. And at the time, I was the youngest scout under the employ of a major league team at that time at age 21. Spent a few years working for the Cubs. They had cutbacks several years later, and I ended up being one of the scouts who was fired in that cutback. And I moved out to Massachusetts, took a job working for a local radio station in Boston, covering the Red Sox, doing pre and post game interviews, reports from the field, and then participated in a weekly talk show. So I continued to be involved in baseball in some respect, working that way, covering the Red Sox. Then I also, after that, went into education, worked at a couple of preparatory schools in New York City, moved back to Illinois to further my education, work on my graduate degree in American history. And then I ended up teaching in Illinois schools for 20 years. So it's been an interesting journey. And during that process, James, this leads up to what we're going to be talking about today. During that time that I was teaching in Illinois, specifically in Peoria, when I was teaching eighth grade history and language arts, we started this project where my students were corresponding with the aforementioned World War II veterans whose dads all happened to be Civil War veterans, specifically members of the Union Army.
So, Tim, first of all, it's an amazing background you have, such an interesting career. And also, the writing, the knowledge of history, sports, media, journalism, so many skills put together. I think they probably all served you well in teaching,
Well,
really.
they did. And I'm very, very grateful for the education that I had, both at Eastern Illinois and at Illinois State. I was remiss in telling you, James, that I first started to work on my graduate studies in history at Fordham University. And let me tell you, that was absolutely critical to getting me involved in my area of concentration in history, which was the American South, the antebellum period, the Civil War period, and the postbellum period. Just had a phenomenal experience at Fordham. I can't say enough about the profs at Fordham University.
Oh, fantastic. Now, so you've got this eighth grade class.
Yes.
Can you give me an idea? Where did this idea come from? Was it from you? Was it from a student? Was it from somebody else? How did the idea of having children, middle school children, reaching out to these elderly veterans?
Sure. Well, that all came about by an experience that I had with an organization called Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And I was a member for many, many years. James, you'll probably remember that there were different fraternal orders to which the Union veterans belonged after the Civil War. One of them was the Union Veterans Legion. Another was Union Veterans Union. But the organization that was the largest among all of these fraternal orders for the Union veterans was the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. And I'm trying to remember at one time, James, I think maybe more than 600,000 Union veterans belonged to this fraternal order. And the heir to the Grand Army of the Republic eventually came and became an organization called Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And some of the members of the Sons of Union Veterans, James, were actually also GAR members, because of course you had fathers and sons who went into the Civil War. Well, anyway, the Sons of Union Veterans organization, which has been in existence since the 1880s, is still very active today. And I belong to the post, or I'm sorry, not the GAR were the posts. And I'm trying to think of what the camps. The camps are the names given to the local organizations throughout the country for the Sons of Union Veterans. And so I had an opportunity while I was a member to attend a couple of the national encampments over the years. One was held in Louisville. Another one I went to was held right in Springfield, Illinois, which is little more than an hour's drive from Peoria. So I took that opportunity to attend with other members of our local camp to go to the national encampment in Springfield one year. And so I was sitting in one of the meetings, and there was actually what we call a real son who was in attendance. And real sons and real daughters are those people who are the children of Union veterans. So there was a gentleman named Ed Blakely who was in the audience, and he was recognized as at that meeting being the only real son who was in attendance. Now, Mr. Blakely was born, I believe, in 1902, so that would have made him 99 or 100 at the time of this meeting. And so I'm thinking as I'm sitting there, my gosh, what an opportunity, James, this is going to be for me. This was in August, so we were a couple of weeks outside the beginning of the school year. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what a wonderful opportunity this would be to have Mr. Blakely be in contact with one of my middle school students back in Peoria. So I went over to him at the end of the meeting, and he had a cane, but I found out later that cane was just for effect. He really didn't need it. If you had seen James, Mr. Blakely, he appeared to be someone maybe in his mid 80s. So he was in wonderful constitution, both physically and mentally. I said, Mr. Blakely, my name is Tim Pletkovich. I am so happy to be able to meet you today. I'm anxious to hear about your father. I said, I happen to be a middle school teacher in Peoria, Illinois, and I would love for one of my middle school students to write to you and learn more about your life and the life of your father. And I said, it's so interesting to learn that he was a Michigan cavalry soldier during the Civil War. What do you say? Would you be interested? And he took his cane because he had his address on his cane. He flipped it up in the air to me, James, and he said, there you go, kid. Do with it what you'd like. and so later that night at the dinner, the culminating dinner that they have every year for this, I'm looking over prior to the dinner, and I look in the bar, and there are several members of the Michigan contingent who are celebrating with drinks, highballs. And I look out there, and they're singing Civil War songs, Union veteran songs. And I look in, and I see Mr. Blakely right in the middle of all of this, having a shot and just enjoying himself to the utmost. And I was with a couple of the Illinois members, and I said, that's that Mr. Blakely. That's that guy I was telling you about. And this Larry said to me, he's the one who's a pre-centenarian? And I said, yes, that is he. And he said, oh my gosh, you've hit the jackpot. And I said, of course I had. So when I got back to Illinois at the end of the weekend, I called one of my middle school students. Now, once again, this is a couple of weeks outside the beginning of the school year, James. And I said to him, Kwame, I said, I had the most unusual, and this kid was a really cerebral kid, so he understood the uniqueness of this. And I said, Kwame, I met a gentleman over the weekend whose dad was a Civil War soldier. And I said, I talked to him, and he said he'd be happy to correspond with one of my middle school students going into 8th grade for this year. And I said, what do you say? Well, there was a pause on the phone. He didn't say anything. And then he said, no. You didn't meet anybody whose dad was a Civil War soldier. He said, I know how long ago the Civil War was. And I said, no, Kwame, the thing is, the Civil War vet was pretty old. He was past middle age when he fathered this Mr. Blakely. And so he understood it. So he came into school. And so he sat down. We thought up several questions to ask Mr. Blakely. Mr. Blakely went ahead then and responded to our query right away. It was only maybe about a week, 6 or 7 days after sending the letter that we had a reply from Mr. Blakely. And he told Kwame that he was so excited, that Kwame was excited, and that he would be happy to answer all of his questions for him. And so when Kwame received his answers, he said, well, this is great. He said, now I have more questions based upon what he told me. So Kwame sat down and he wrote a second letter to Mr. Blakely before the beginning of the school year. And Mr. Blakely wrote back a second time before the beginning of the school year. So now I'm thinking, if this is working this well with Mr. Blakely, maybe the Sons of Union Veterans could procure a list for me of all of those known sons of Civil War soldiers from the Union Army who are still living today. Well, sure enough, they came through with a list which had about 35 names on it, James. And so when we got back into the school year, a couple of weeks into it, and in the meantime, Kwame's received the third letter from Mr. Blakely. So I approached some of the eighth grade English students I had one day. And they said, and I said to them, what do you think about this of corresponding with these gentlemen who are the sons of Civil War soldiers? Well, they thought that sounded kind of interesting. It sounded more interesting than reading something out of a book to them, as several of them said later on. So we sent out, we did a mass mailing, and each of the students, most of them had two people to whom they wrote. And it wasn't long, James, and we started getting responses. Probably, I'd say within 7 to 10 days, several of these Sons of Union veterans had written. Unfortunately, so as you can imagine, the attrition rate was pretty high.
Sure.
So on the list, we did have a few people who were deceased, but nevertheless, in almost every case, they had sons or daughters or grandchildren who wrote to us on their behalf, made copies for us of different pension records as well as governmental records. A lot of them had the release records, the discharge, the honorable discharge records. So they made copies of those. Others sent articles to us that had appeared in different newspapers talking about the Civil War children, their respective fathers or grandfathers. So we even heard from the families of those who had expired. Fortunately, most of the recipients of these letters were living. They were doing terrifically at the time. Most of them were in their 70s or 80s. A few were in their 90s, like Mr. Blakely. Well, the kids really were interested in this, especially with the promptness to which their letters had been read and then subsequent correspondence had occurred. So they continued to write to their new pen pals, their septuagenarian or octogenarian or nonagenarian pen pals. This was wonderful. And so this barrage of correspondence just continued throughout the fall. Long about the middle of October, late October, maybe by November, many of these sons had started to write something that became pretty prevalent, and they would say, we've had several correspondences. I've tried to give you as much information, much background as I have. We've even had phone calls with several of you, and they said, unfortunately, maybe I've told you pretty much what I can tell you about my dad, because in some cases, James, they were quite young when their fathers died. Others were in their teen years, late teen years, even adulthood when their elderly fathers died. But nevertheless, a lot of them had said, I think I've told you pretty much what I can. Then all of a sudden it hit. Most of our correspondents were born within a 5-year period, say, of 1920. Most within the range of 1915, 1925, a few later. And I thought, well, these guys are World War II veterans, because they even said in the letters, I guess I'll have to be content with my own recollections of the time that I spent in the service. So I got to thinking, and I said to the kids, I said, you keep corresponding with them. And it doesn't have to be necessarily just about their father's war experiences or what it was like growing up with them. I said, you just keep corresponding with them. And I said, tell them about school. Tell them how they're doing. Find out as much as you can about these folks, what they're doing right now. I said, I'm going to start to write to them and call them individually and find out about their lives growing up during the Depression and then fighting in World War II. And I said to the kids, you'll be surprised. The more you continue to write, the longer you can further this project, they'll come up with things about their fathers that they hadn't thought about in a long time. So, James, they continued to procure these nuggets as they were continuing their correspondence with these Civil War sons. Well, in the meantime, then, I'm developing narratives with extensive interviews where I'm visiting with these folks about what it was like during the Depression, what it was like in the years leading up to World War II, and then what they experienced during their own time in service. And of course, their experience was very, very varied. We had people from the Army, people from the Army Air Corps, people from the Navy. They all had experiences. Some were on the front lines fighting. Others were working in other capacities. And one of the women with whom we were in contact also was a commissioned officer in the WWII. And so she had wonderful World War II narratives to share with us, wonderful experiences. So this was how this was all working. In the meantime, my principal was getting really interested in this. And and by the way, the real sons gave us the addresses of their sisters, the real daughters. So now we go from a pool of about 28 to about 56. So now we have about 56 participants. Well, eventually, some of the kids did drop out because this was a lot of work. But I had a core of about a dozen students, 12 or 15, who wanted to continue with the project. So they took up correspondence with those students who had passed the obligatory work and who were no longer working on a day-to-day basis on this. So now we have 12 students, 15 students who are corresponding with almost 60 of these Civil War children. So they were corresponding some 3, 4, 5, even 6 pen pals at one time. And we would stay 4 out of the 5 nights out of the week, Monday through Thursday, after school, working on this as we continued to develop the narratives pertaining to these children's fathers' lives. And then I would work subsequently on the interviews pertaining to the Depression and World War II. So the students and I were working in concert on this on an average of 3 to 4 hours a night after school. So we would start, James, probably about 3:30, and we would finish in time for dinner, 6:30 at night, sometimes later. Most of the kids lived in the neighborhood, which was a great thing. And so that was not really a problem. So this is how this all developed. As a result, during the fall, my principal, Felix Lobdell, is a wonderful individual, former professional football player who grew up in that neighborhood on the south side of Peoria, came back to give to the community and was just a wonderful principal. He said, Tim, he said, this is pretty interesting what these kids are doing. And he said, from their backgrounds, from the backgrounds of these kids, coming from an area where there's a lot of economic deprivation, a lot of violence, he said, these kids' families don't always get in the papers for the right things. He said, these kids are doing something, you've got them hooked on doing something extraordinary right now. He said, I'm going to call the local paper and the Peoria Journal-Star. And he said, I want them to do something. So anyway, I was contacted by the Journal-Star. They did a big feature story on the students. It was laden with their quotations and their experiences with all of this. And then that article in the Journal-Star went out over the AP wire. Well, the Wall Street Journal took notice to it, the Chicago Tribune took notice to it, and the Washington Times. So they all ended up contacting the school, and they wanted to do feature stories on the kids. So we ended up with feature stories in those major dailies. Now this is really beginning to attract a lot of attention. And after the articles, there were 2 articles that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, one in the Washington Times, one in the Chicago Tribune. They were very liberal with the amount of space they gave to this. And it was wonderful. With this, the school started receiving letters from people of notoriety, as well as just common everyday people who thought what a wonderful experience this was for the kids. Well, it also created interest on the part of publishing companies. So one day after the Washington Times article had appeared, I had a phone call from a publisher in Nashville. in Nashville, Tennessee. And this gentleman wondered if he thought we had enough material for a book because this was so intrinsically different from anything, James, that he'd ever seen. He'd never thought about a book about World War II veterans whose dads were Civil War soldiers. And I said, I hadn't really given this a lot of thought at this point. I said, actually, we hope to be doing this for a few years. And I said, some of the kids have said they'd like to continue with the project after eighth grade, continue it on into high school. And so he said, well, let me know. The very next day, James, I had a call from a publisher, Vandermeer Press. And Vandermeer Press was well known for its books on Washington, D.C. They were located in Washington, D.C. for several years. They had relocated and opened an office in St. Petersburg, Florida. So this gentleman named Art Brown introduces himself to me. He calls the next day. He said, Tim, he said, I was really intrigued by this. He said, I still get the Washington Times, even though we're down here in St. Pete. And he said, I was wondering have you ever thought about this as a possible book? And I said, yeah, Mr. Brown, I thought about it yesterday. and, and so anyway, we stayed in touch. He arranged to meet me in Chicago when he was coming to a conference for the American Library Association. We had extensive visits for a couple of days, and we had a handshake agreement. We stayed in touch. I started to develop this for him, putting it into narrative forms. And as a result, so I gave him a couple sample chapters. He hurriedly sent me a contract, which was a pretty generous contract, actually. And so it was signed. And as a result, then, about a year and a half later, the book came out. And it was so neat, James, because the way we worked out the royalties, which it was very nicely offered, what we had by Mr. Brown and company, worked it out so that most of the royalties went into a trust fund for those students who had worked on the project. And so when it came time for them to go to college, they could apply to this trust fund for the monies which had come from the royalties from the book. And then this would help them to defray college expenses. Well, this was my last year at that school. I had taught at that school several years. I ended up teaching in the Peoria school system at two different schools, but we continued with the same project. So not only did it encompass that group of eighth graders that year, but it continued to encompass these sixth and seventh graders from other schools. So we had students who were as young as 10 and 11 years old who were working on this project. So it ended up encompassing probably a little over 24 students I'll say between 25 and 30, who could apply to this trust fund over the years. And a few of the students took advantage of this. It helped to defray a lot of their college expenses. The book ended up going into 3 separate printings. And so it did pretty well. For a medium-sized publishing company, we were very, very pleased with the number of copies that it sold over the years.
Wow, that is terrific. When I read the book, I love the way it was laid out because you would get an idea of the Civil War veteran, and then you would get the viewpoint of that veteran from the children of that veteran.
Yes.
And then you would hear the stories about the World War II military experiences that the children of the Civil War veterans had. So you got this incredible span of history through just 2 generations,
Yes.
as communicated to eighth grade students. So what I saw going on in this book was just this tale. We love storytelling on our podcast. Everybody knows that. That's
Yes.
why we do it. But this is a way of, I think storytelling is becoming a lost art. And I think what you were accomplishing back in 2007 when you did this or before was that for the students, they were learning to write. They were writing to these people,
Yes.
communicating, asking questions, receiving and reading this information, and then perhaps having to explore some of the things that were communicated to them about the Civil War, maybe doing a little extra work on the side to find out what it meant, follow-up
Yes.
questions. It's almost like a little journalism wrapped up in there too, like asking,
Yes, absolutely. Well,
interviewing?
remember, James, this started out as an English project.
Yes, well,
Yeah.
that's the whole thing. So you're seeing that, and then ultimately, you're engaging also the veteran, the
Yes.
elderly person, unlocking their mind, having them in a comfortable situation where they're feeling able to communicate. And as you said, there had to be sometimes some follow up to pick their memory even more, because I know I've had experiences in the past speaking with older people, older relatives. You may
Yes.
say, "Hey, Grandpa, what do you remember about World War One?" And at first, it'll be like, "Oh, just a couple little things like that," and then all of a sudden, you meet with them again, and you say, "Is there anything else you remember?" After we spoke, I recalled after you left that
Yes.
this, and then all of a sudden, these treasures start flowing out of their mouths or out from their pens. This is probably one of the most memorable learning experiences a middle schooler can have, because this is stuff that they can put in the bank. When I mean put in the bank, I mean it that they were able to remember the whole process and how fascinating it was. And now, 17 years later, one son, I understand, of a Union veteran living. So over
Of
the
of a Civil War veteran at this point.
of a
Yeah.
Civil War
He's
veteran.
there's no one left on the Confederate side.
Nobody left. So that's it. So now just in that short amount of time, all that information would have been gone if that book didn't happen. You know what I mean? You'd have just one person left, and you had a whole bunch at that time. So the time that you did it was critical, and the way you did it was critical, and it obviously was a great learning experience. So Tim, what I want to do now is I just want to talk about just a few of the families that were profiled in this book. Okay. They're all excellent stories, but these stood out to me because one of the families I was just mentioning about, the Poole family, there's still a World War II veteran, son of a Union soldier. And the man who's still alive is Bill Poole, but his dad was a man named Charles Poole. He was in the 6th
Yes.
Virginia Volunteer Infantry. Could
Yes.
you talk a little just about that story for us?
Sure. Sure. Charles Parker Poole was born in 1844 in what at that time was the western part of Virginia, which later became ostensibly became West Virginia, James. And in that part of Virginia, at the time that he was born, leading up to the Civil War, there were very, very few slaves. And so most of the people who lived in that part of Virginia remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War. And as we know, eventually in 1863, that part of Virginia actually became West Virginia. That whole thing is very, very interesting. When we look at the parts of the South where there were not large numbers of slaves, those areas remained loyal with the Union, and the people, for the most part, fought for the Union Army. So, anyway, Charles Parker Poole was born in 1844 in Harrison County, what became West Virginia, and he enlisted at the age of 17 in 1861 at the beginning of the war and served a 3 year term of service. He was discharged in 1864. He remained in that western part of Virginia during the time that he was in the service. And that regiment was detached to guard duty and work service along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. They were protecting those railroads because of the disruption that the Confederate soldiers were causing in terms of transportation. And so that's what constituted most of his service. One of the things that they did, of course, they had to remove foliage, they had to cut down trees.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, at one point during his service, Private Poole had a tree limb that fell on him and it crushed part of his leg. And it was not amputated right away, but later on it was. It was impractical for him to continue with this injury that he had. So that's how his children remember him, was walking around, going hunting in the forest when they were kids, going around with crutches and hunting, and then whatever game he caught, he'd put in the crooks of his crutches. And so they remember him as someone who was physically challenged, but someone who really didn't appear to be absent of anything because he lived a very, very full life until his expiration at the age of 89.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's crazy.
It was interesting. Mr. Poole had been married a couple times previously, and he had had a couple of children through his first marriage. And so he was living in this neighborhood in Northwest Arkansas. We're not sure how this man who came from Virginia ended up in Northwest Arkansas. That's a little sketchy. But anyway, he knew of a woman in the neighborhood who was divorced and who was raising some young children, and she was pretty poor. And so Mr. Poole was receiving full disability pension from the government at that time. And so he was secretively sending some money to this young woman to subsidize her on a regular basis, to be able to help her family. Well, she got wind of this, and anyway, a friendship developed pretty soon after. It was more than just a friendship. And so Mr. Poole married. He remarried at the age of 71, and his wife was 27 at the time. They had several years of marriage because, as I mentioned, almost 20 years, James, because he lived until 1933 and died at the age of 89. And they had 5 children themselves. And it was interesting because they did this the same way that a family might do it today, where they're planning their families. They were married in 1915, and the first child was born about 10 months later in 1916. Child number 2 was born in 1918. Child number 3 was born 4 years later in 1922. Child number 4, Bill Poole, to whom you have alluded, was born in 1925, 3 years after that. And then the youngest, Garland, was born in 1927 when his father was 83 years old.
I was going to say, Tim, that's a long time after the Civil War that these these kids were born, I'll say.
Isn't that something? And then see, after Mr. Poole died, the children became the recipients of his pension monies
Mhm.
until they reached the age of 16. Once they reached the age of 16, it was cut off.
Right.
Now, there was a law that was created around the turn of the 20th century, James, a national law that any woman after a certain date who was marrying a Union veteran would have to wait then until the age of 60 before she would be able to collect on her husband's pension. So I'm trying to put this in the proper number of years. Mrs. Poole, his wife Clara, was born in 1888. And so the pension monies for Garland, who was born in 1927, would have ended in 1943. So she only had to wait a few years before she became 60. And then from that point on, she was the sole person in the family to receive the pension monies. And she lived until 1990, James, when she was almost 102 years old. So she was receiving the pension then for 42 more years.
That's not a bad deal. So you mentioned there were three surviving sons and a daughter. So there's some narrative around what their stories were. But
Yes,
Bill Poole, the one who is still alive and going strong, was born in
yes,
1825, and he, from what I read, he served in at the Battle of the Bulge, and he was also captured and then later
yes,
released by the Germans during
yes,
that battle. So he has his own stories to tell. But to think of, somebody, a World War II veteran who's out there was fighting the Germans, and his father was fighting the Confederates
yes.
in the Civil
Yeah.
War. It is so crazy. So great story. I just want to move on to another family called the Schaus family.
James, if I could interject something, just, talking about the richness of this correspondence that these kids had with these Civil War children, because this is all part of this. I wanted to go back to the very first person my students were interviewing, this Ed Blakely. And Kwame had this fast and furious communication with him throughout the fall. All of a sudden, this is a great story, and I'll encapsulate it for you. All of a sudden, Kwame didn't hear from him. And he was very concerned because we went about 3 or 4 weeks without any communication. So Kwame is a pretty sharp kid, realizing that this guy is almost 100 years old. He's thinking the same thing I'm thinking. And so, anyway, we come to the end of the semester. We're at the day before, we go on Christmas break. And he hasn't said anything to me specifically about what we're assuming happened. I haven't said anything. And he said, and he stayed after school. And I knew he wanted to talk. And he said, Mr. Pletkovich, he said, whatever has happened with Mr. Blakely, I'll always be grateful for all the letters that I have, all of the communication that he gave. And I said, Kwame, that's a very realistic, that's a philosophical way to look at it. I think you're absolutely right. So he went home. Well, I'm down in the office then about an hour later. I'm still at school, and there's a banging on the back door. So Principal Lobdell says to me, he said, Plet, go see who's at the back door, who's knocking. Maybe it's one of the kids messing around. Well, I go to the back door, and it's Kwame, and he's holding something. He's jumping up and down, screaming, Mr. Pletkovich, Mr. Pletkovich. So I opened up the door, and I said, what's wrong, buddy? Why are you back? And he said, he was holding a postcard, and he goes, I've got great news. Mr. Blakely isn't dead. And it was a postcard from Mr. Blakely where he says, Kwame, he said, forgot to tell you, my wife and I are snowbirds. We're in Florida for the winter. Let's hold off on the communication until next spring. And he said, then we can pick it up. Pick it up, they did. Kwame went on to high school. He stayed in touch in high school with Mr. Blakely until Mr. Blakely ultimately did pass away.
Wow.
But I'll never forget that, how excited he was.
That is fantastic. What a great story that is. Oh,
it was. Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
back to the Schaus family.
Yeah.
What can you tell us? I understand Hiram Craig Schaus was in the 11th Illinois Volunteer Infantry. He was wounded 3 times at Fort Donelson.
Yes.
He went to I guess a field hospital, and what happened there kind of encouraged him to become a doctor, correct?
Yes, correct. Hiram was 18 at the time that he went into the 11th Illinois Volunteers, and they were stationed what was called at the time the West. And so not long after he enlisted in the Army, he was fighting in the West in Tennessee at the Battle of Fort Donelson in February of 1862. And as you said, James, he suffered multiple injuries. And one of the injuries involved his arm where he was shot. And so he was moved from the field of battle to a field hospital, and then subsequently was sent to Southern Illinois, a town called Mound City, which is very, very close to the Ohio River, not far at all from Kentucky. And as serendipity would have it, there was a woman from Hiram's hometown of Effingham, Illinois, who was serving as a nurse in Mound City, Illinois. Now, she had gone there for the express purpose of nursing her injured husband. He had been injured also at the same time at Fort Donelson, and he died subsequently. But she decided to remain at this makeshift hospital in Mound City, Illinois, caring for the other wounded soldiers. Well, one day she comes across Hiram Schaus, and she said, oh my gosh. She said, I know this young man. She tells people, this is Hiram Schaus from my hometown of Effingham, Illinois. And doctors are preparing to remove his arm because they don't think that it's healing expediently. And you know how liberally that happened, James, during the war. The arms and legs were amputated at a very high rate. And so anyway, she was there the day that the doctors were going to remove his arm. And she intervened and she said, Doctor, this is an 18-year-old man. He has his whole life ahead of him. He served his country nobly, was injured in battle 3 times. Can't you wait 2 more days to see if this is healing properly? Well, she was able to propitiate this doctor into laying off of Schaus for a couple, 2 or 3 more days. As a result, 2 or 3 days later, the wound was healing significantly. So she staved off this Hiram Schaus losing his arm. He always felt that he wanted to be able to give back in life in some way where he could be physically utilizing his body as a result of still having all of his parts. So he became a country doctor in Illinois, and then later the family moved to South Dakota. So for many, many decades, even into his early 80s, he continued to provide medical services for the people of South Dakota. Now, there's an interesting side story with this, James. So I'm on one of the Peoria radio stations one day when we're promoting the book. I'm telling this story about Hiram Schaus, and I give the name of the nurse who attended to him and who was responsible for saving his arm. I get a phone call when I'm back at school later in the day, and it's from a woman with the last name of Zimmerman, who was actually a great great granddaughter of this nurse who saved Dr. Schaus's arm. Well, anyways, of course, she's very interested in the book because her ancestor's name appears in this book. So anyway, so she comes over to my apartment then that night. And I thought, this is so interesting that I have a woman here sitting with me whose great great grandmother was responsible for saving this Private Schaus's arm. I said, let's call one of Private Schaus's children right now. So we called Dr. Schaus's daughter, Eileen, and I put them on the phone, and it was on speaker. And James, I can't tell you what a special phone call this was. At the end of the conversation, this Eileen Schaus Weiss, the daughter of Dr. Schaus, private in the Union Army, says to this Mrs. Zimmerman, Mrs. Zimmerman, I can't say thank you to your great great grandmother, but I can say thank you to you. Thanks to her, my father was able to fulfill a dream and serve for several decades, helping the people of South Dakota, all because your great great grandmother was responsible for saving my father's arm.
Beautiful story. And if your book hadn't come out with the kids corresponding to those old veterans, that wouldn't have happened. That ability to, an opportunity to say thank you wouldn't have been there.
Yes.
That is great. I know that Hiram Schaus it was Hank and Eileen, that both of them served in World War II. Eileen was in the Navy.
Yeah, yes. And then Hank also, correct.
And
Yeah.
Hank was in the Army Air Corps, I believe, in search and rescue.
Yes.
So cool story. And one last one I wanted to ask you about. This is the Upham family, and William
Yes.
Upham, who went on to become the governor of Wisconsin, was in the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry and was
Yes.
wounded in the chest at the Battle of Bull Run.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that story?
This was very, very interesting to me. And once again, we have these coincidences that have developed as a result of the book, learning all of these things. I had a maternal great great grandfather who served in the same regiment along with young Upham, the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, which became part of a brigade, James, that was known as the Iron Brigade or Black Hat Brigade. And they were the 2nd Wisconsin, which was part of the brigade, was the first regiment to be mustered for 3 years of service in the Union Army. So right away in May of 1861, after Lincoln's call for volunteers, they're already in uniform. And so anyway, the Iron Brigade, and they weren't called the Iron Brigade early in the war. That became later. They were like iron. My gosh, they were stubborn. And they fought terrifically. Well, anyway, so they were sent to the east, and they fight at the Battle of First Bull Run. Subsequently, my ancestor and William Upham are both injured. And one ends up, my great great granddad ended up at Georgetown Hospital in D.C. And then Will Upham ended up being captured on the field of battle by Confederate soldiers. And he was then taken to Libby Prison in Richmond. And then he spent the next several months as a prisoner of war at Libby Prison. He did receive medical attention. But what was interesting about all of that, James, was that it was reported that Upham had been killed at the Battle of Bull Run. And he was engaged at the time to a woman back in Racine, Wisconsin. So she was notified, the family was notified, and a funeral service subsequently took place for Upham. Now, here he's not dead, but they have a funeral service for him. And then the family later receives word that he did not die, but that he was in fact taken prisoner. He was injured, was taken prisoner, and was being interned at Libby in Richmond, Virginia. So now the family has received two telegrams. Well, the prisoner exchanges were much more frequent at the beginning of the war. And so most of the prisoners who at that time were in Libby, and this would have been in February of 1862. So he's been in prison for all of August, September, October, November, December, January, and now we're in February. Most of them were released, and most of them were sent to Camp Parole, Maryland on the same day. So they exited the prison, most of them on the same day. Well, for whatever reason, Upham did not go out with the majority of prisoners on that day. And so when the list of names came through, those who had been removed from Libby Prison and returned to the Union Army, Upham's name was not on the list. So now the family receives word that Upham was not on the list, so it is assumed that he died while he was in Libby Prison. So here we have at the beginning, the family has been informed that he died. Then the family is informed with a second telegram that he's alive. Now the family is informed with a third telegram that he is dead, when in fact he is alive, still at Libby Prison. So the next day, he was released with the remainder of prisoners and goes to Camp Parole, Maryland. So then the family receives a fourth telegram that he in fact is alive. So you can imagine the flood of emotions they're experiencing, as well as his soon-to-be bride. So anyway, while he's at Camp Parole, Maryland, he is intercepted by someone who says that Senator Doolittle from Wisconsin would like to meet with you in Washington. So I'm going to be accompanying you to Washington, D.C. Well, what had happened was this. Senator Doolittle was from Racine, Wisconsin. He was familiar with the Upham family. I don't know that he actually knew Will, because Will would have been a kid. You know, he was only 18 at this time. But nevertheless, Senator Doolittle knew different members of the Upham family. Well, it was a pretty large family. And so anyway, so when Will Upham arrives in Washington, D.C., he's met at the train station by Senator Doolittle. Senator Doolittle, in turn, says to him, we want to extrapolate as much information as we can from you about the conditions that prisoners have just endured at Libby. So we need to go to the White House. And he said, President Lincoln would like to speak with you. Then Senator Doolittle accompanied Upham to the White House, and a private meeting was held with the three of them. And Lincoln is, of course, very, very anxious for news about what kind of conditions they're actually experiencing. Now, this was at the beginning of the war, so I can't state what it would have been like at Libby Prison, James, later on in the war. But Upham said that the conditions while he was there at Libby actually were tolerable. And actually, he was knitting. I'm trying to remember what it was. He knitted a coat during the time that he was imprisoned there. I can't remember specifically a lot about it. But anyway, so Lincoln, has this hour-long meeting with him. And at the end of the meeting, he says to Lincoln, and everything we know about Lincoln, you can just hear him saying this. He says, young man, he said, for someone who is at such a young age, he said, I think you've done a lot for your country already. He said, how would you like an honorable discharge? And I would like to appoint you to the next group of cadets at West Point. Upham thought that that was a pretty good deal, having just experienced what he had. So he took the discharge, and began attending West Point then in the fall of 1862. Well, he took his entrance exams, of course, prior to being accepted into West Point. And while he was taking his entrance exams that week, Lincoln happened to be at West Point. So he, of course, was very interested in how his appointees were doing. This was a joint appointment. It was through Lincoln as well as, because we always hear about your United States Senator appointing you. So it was a joint appointment. But yeah, there are presidential appointments to the different academies. So anyway, Lincoln sent word to speak with Upham. So Will said, "Oh, Mr. President, it's so nice to see you again." And he said, "Well, it's so nice to see you." And he said, "I'm wondering how you did on your entrance examinations this week. Do you think you did well?" Now, Lincoln already knew Upham's results for the entrance examinations, but he didn't tell him. and and so Lincoln's asking him, and Upham says, "Well, sir, I think I did well, but I haven't been notified as to my status as yet." And Lincoln concluded the conversation by putting his hand on Upham's shoulder and patting him and saying, "I think you probably did fine, young man. Good luck." But never telling him that he had passed. So Upham then serves at West Point, or as a student at West Point then in the class of 1866. So 4 years later, in 1866, he graduates. Now, James, Upham has to serve of course, the obligatory 4 years in the American Army after having graduated from West Point. So he ends up being assigned to Fort Monroe, Virginia, to do much of his service. Now, Fort Monroe, Virginia is where Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his family are being interned. Okay. You'll never guess who had guard duty over an 18-month period on an 8-hour shift each night over Jefferson Davis.
Upham.
You guessed it. It was Will Upham. They developed a wonderful rapport. And as you can imagine, there isn't a lot going on at night. And so they would spend their time playing chess or checkers and just talking about every conceivable subject that there was. Well, one of the things that Upham wrote about later, he was so fascinated that Jefferson Davis knew so much about the history of Wisconsin, its topography, geography. And the reason for that was, of course, because during the Black Hawk War, in the 1830s, Jefferson Davis had spent a lot of time in Wisconsin along the Mississippi River. Anyway, they had a lot of commonalities, actually, and they spent a lot of time talking about American history.
So this information about Upham and this whole story about him and Jefferson Davis and everything, was this gleaned from interviews with the children of Upham, or was this information assembled from other sources as well?
Yeah, it was from other sources, James. What Governor Upham did at the time of his death, he had all of his papers housed at the Wisconsin Historical Society.
Okay.
And so, I was able to pour through Civil War letters there at the Wisconsin Historical Society.
Okay, that makes sense. And so basically you did a lot of fleshing out as well as the letters from the children of the Civil War veterans. So these stories are just amazing. I don't know how these would have come out in publication, with this new information or revived information if you hadn't done this project with a kid. So it just sounds like a win-win for the history community, the researching community, education in general. Do you have any thoughts for teachers or others who might be interested in getting kids involved in either like oral history projects or situations where they write to, say, World War II veteran or Korean War veteran, Vietnam, what have you? Do you have any suggestions for somebody who might want to get involved in something like that?
Well, to do it correctly, James, and we touched on this before, this isn't a one-day project. And if the students really want to learn about that person, it's probably going to take several letters. And, and we've discussed those reasons already. So I just, whatever I've done with my students, I've always wanted the projects to be able to succeed. And to be able to really succeed, this isn't something that can be done haphazardly. It isn't something that, is just a one-shot thing. It's something that there has to be a critical focus to it. And naturally, not every student is going to become endeared to this, although most of the kids really enjoyed it. But once again, my group of students who furthered the project and who were really responsible for this evolving into a book constituted about 15 kids. So, find out what the kids' passions are. Know your students. Know who they are. I didn't pick that Kwame, that student, to kick off this project randomly. I picked it up because I knew who he was. I knew his background. I knew who his great uncle and great aunt were who were raising him. I knew all about the kid. I knew he'd be the right one to start the project.
Right. Wow, that's really, really good advice. I did want to back up just quickly on the Upham family. So William Upham went on to become governor of Wisconsin,
Yes,
and also the two children who were interviewed were William Upham Jr., who was in the National Guard and was eventually wounded, I think, in World War II, and then his brother Frederick, who was in the U.S.
yeah,
Army Air Corps. He was a flight instructor. I think he's the one
right.
on the cover of
Yes,
the book who looks just like his father. So you've got a Civil War soldier and a World War II, both in there. I think both. Yeah, I got the book right here.
yeah. The one is pictured in his Army cadet uniform, the
Yeah.
father in 1862. Son's pictured in his Army Air Corps uniform, 1942. Dad was born in 1841. Son was born in 1921. They're both pictured at age 21. However, the age difference is 80 years.
It is 80 years. Well, Tim, this has been so much fun talking to you about this book and all this information that's come out. What a great project. I hope some people listening to this it'll give them some ideas and talk to some teachers or their teachers themselves who may want to do something like this. How can people find out more about Tim Pletkovich and what you're up to?
That's kind of hard because I haven't put a whole lot out there, James, but I'm working on a new book right now with the grandchildren and great grandchildren of American presidents. We're talking about how the presidents and their descendants, how their ancestors laid the groundwork for the values and type of people that they are. We have a lot of diversity in the different American presidents. Many of them are descended from Puritan New Englanders. We have others who are descendants of the Tidewater, Virginia area, like Jefferson, Washington, Monroe, Madison, those folks. Then we have people who are descendants from the Celts, from the people of the northern part of Britain. And so there's a great diversity there. So we're learning a lot about how the unique cultural aspects of these different presidents have survived through centuries. And they really have. And then also, these children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren of American presidents are weighing in on how their presidential ancestors would react today if they were transported to the present, how they would react politically. What would they do to try and bring the country together in this massive divide that we currently have?
Well, that sounds cool. I can't wait till that book comes out because I want to get a copy of it right away. And
You have a free copy for
thank you
sure.
so much. Will you sign it for me too, Tim?
You bet I will. I'll be happy to.
Hey, listen, this has been a lot of fun. I hope you have a great fall and winter season, and I wish you the best with your book. And thank you for being an inspiration to your students and to those who are interested in history and others.
James, this has been such a delight. It's always fun to be able to connect with someone who appreciates history. And James, everything that you do, and I think I told you before, and please include this. When I told George Cleveland, Grover Cleveland's grandson, that you had contacted me, he said, well, Tim, you have to do this. He said, James is the real thing. He said, he's a wonderful interviewer, and the podcasts that he presents are so enlightening that, James just is immersed in American history. He loves it. So, James, it's always fun to connect with someone like you, and I hope we can stay in touch for a long, long time.
Thanks, Tim. Absolutely. And I got to give credit to my wife, Kelly.
Yes.
It wouldn't happen without her. I'll tell you that right now. But thanks again, Tim. And I hope you have a great day. Okay.
Thank you so much, James. A good day to you as well.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.